Welcome to the Australian Institute of International Affairs. My name's Alastair. I'm Executive Director at AAA in Victoria, and thank you all very much for joining us. There's been a lot of interest in this event. So welcome to members of AAA, to our other guests, and to members of the Diplomatic Corps. The brief housekeeping, we'll take questions towards the end, so please feel free to type any of your questions in the Q&A tab in your toolbar or vote on questions from other people. We'll get through as many as we can. So for this next installment of Richard Irons' acclaimed In Conversation series, and to discuss the topic of why did the Afghan Army evaporate, it's our pleasure to welcome from the UK, Tim Willasey-Wilsey. Tim is a visiting professor of war studies at King's College London. He's a former senior British diplomat and served with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office for 27 years, ending up as a director. His overseas postings were in Angola, Central America, Pakistan, and at the UK mission to the United Nations in Geneva. He's focused much on Asia, India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, and has traveled extensively in the region. His interlocutor, Richard Irons, well known to many of you as president of AAI Victoria, served for 37 years with the British Army, with deployments to Northern Ireland, the Falklands, Oman, the Balkans, Sierra Leone, and Iraq. He was a visiting fellow at the Changing Character of War program at Oxford University and was lead editor of a book called British Generals in Blair's Wars. So Richard and Tim, thank you very much for your time and for joining us. I'll hand over to you and I'll see you at the Q&A.
Thank you, Alastair. Tim, the sudden and unexpected, I think, fall of Afghanistan, or at least the fall of the Western-supported Afghan government, it's been widely reported in the media as one of the most significant events so far this century. And an unmitigated disaster for the United States, the West, and the idea of democratic liberalism. We'll later in this conversation explore whether you think the long-term impact of what's happened in Afghanistan is in fact as far-reaching and as dire as is made out. But first, I'd like to examine how we got to this point. So perhaps we can discuss why the USA pulled out of Afghanistan, when and in the manner it did. Now, Biden called it the forever war, but for the past 10 years, it's actually been a very low-key war as far as the West is concerned. Only a small number of Western forces providing key enablers, in particular air power, to the Afghan forces who actually did most of the fighting. American and Western casualties were almost negligible in this period. So why the sudden loss of strategic patience after having invested so much?
Well, Richard, first, hello, and hello to all your guests. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you take the British case, which illustrates it rather well, and if you forgive me for focusing on the British angle on this point, we lost 5 dead in the 5 years between 2001 and 2006. We then lost 448 dead in the following 8 years, and then only 4 in the final 6 years. So that demonstrates really that there were 3 very, very separate phases to the Afghan campaign, of which only the middle one, when NATO forces were involved in direct war fighting, was extremely, painful in terms of blood and treasure. So I think you're right on that point. But I mean, it's a fascinating case, this, because if you consider the meeting in the Oval Office when Biden went through his case, it almost seemed like a slam dunk from his point of view. I mean, his arguments would have been, Trump started this withdrawal. To do a U-turn, 180-degree U-turn, would be difficult. AQ is much depleted since 2001. The Afghan government is very inflexible and increasingly corrupt, if that were possible. This hardly justifies US deaths. The other allies aren't really doing much to shoulder the burden. And of course, the United States has got bigger foreign policy priorities, notably China. But above all, I think Biden's point was the US really needs to focus on domestic priorities, where, there are lots of, concerns about, interracial harmony and stuff like that. So put like that, you can actually see why he took the decision. And then I think there are three quite personal things with Biden. One was his famous bust-up with Karzai in January 2009, when he stormed out of the meeting. And they had a very fundamental disagreements on corruption. They had fundamental disagreements on the Pakistani role in Afghanistan. Then there was his experience during the Obama surge, where he pushed for what he called the CT option, which was just 10,000 troops. I think actually he was on the right side of the argument then. And I think he felt that Obama was bullied into a surge by the sort of US military establishment. And then there's a final one, which I think is sort of even more difficult to calibrate, really, which is the Beau Biden effect. His older son who'd served in Iraq, who may well have reported, Biden may well have thought, do I really want to lose my son in a war like this? And I think this is something that he feels quite closely. So at one level, you can almost see how that Oval Office meeting went, and how maybe the others in the room didn't feel able to challenge. But I mean, as we will discuss towards the end of this webinar, actually, if you look at it more holistically, this was, I think, I would contend, a disastrous decision.
Do you think that, and from what you've described, it sounds as though his emotional mindset was stuck in the second phase of those three phases that you discussed, the very bloody and difficult phase of the war, rather than actually the very light touch which the West had been applying for the last 8 years.
Yes, and again, to be fair to Biden, I think many of our populations were stuck in that phase too as well. I think if you went out into the pubs in UK and asked people about Afghanistan, they would immediately flash back to the coffins arriving, from Afghanistan, and the distressed families and so forth like that. I don't think many people had actually grasped how the degree to which Afghanistan had stabilized ever since the withdrawal from war fighting in 2014. Having said that, it wasn't totally stabilized. I mean, the situation was gradually getting worse, with the Taliban becoming gradually more influential. So again, although I think Biden has made a terrible mistake, I think you can understand in many ways how he got there.
The chaos at Kabul airport remain in the world's collective memory, I think, for a long time, echoing 75 in Saigon. Once the decision to withdraw had been made, was it inevitable that this chaos would occur, or could it have been handled differently?
Well, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think however one decides the balance of arguments between staying or leaving, I think the implementation plan was, the implementation aspect of it, I think really was extremely poor. And I think in many ways, this has probably done the most damage to the US reputation around the world. I mean, there is a difficult point here, which is, I think immediately the decision was taken to leave, the strong probability was that it would collapse the Afghan government. And I would argue, I think there was always a strong possibility it would collapse the Afghan army. I'm actually genuinely mystified why people were mystified that the Afghan army collapsed. But then when you think of the actual extraction itself, it would have been much, much better to have done it at winter, when the Taliban couldn't take so much advantage of it. That meant playing for time. It meant playing for a couple more months until sort of October, November, until the snows arrived. I think there was that. I think there was a real question about, could we not have dribbled out some of those people who had supported us over the months, rather than decided to do it in one big bang at Kabul airport on the day, so to speak. And I think the other thing, and I suspect this is something that got lost in the wash somewhere, the impact on the withdrawal of contractors, I don't think was sufficiently thought through. I mean, actually, that was very significant because it was the contractors that kept the Afghan Army, Afghan Air Force in the air. And the withdrawal of that, of course, had very, very significant effects. I think there was also a misunderstanding about the Najibullah period. If you remember, when the Soviets left Afghanistan, the assumption was that the Afghan government, Najibullah government, would collapse immediately. In fact, it hung on for 3 years. And it hung on for 3 years until the Soviet Union came to an end and the funding stopped and so forth. So I think there was a feeling in Washington that, well, this could happen again. But I think they misunderstood two really important things here. Firstly, when the Soviets left, they didn't intend to take, the Afghan elite with them, which is what we've done in this case. So, Najibullah didn't expect to move to Moscow. And the other thing is, I think the attractiveness actually of moving to the Soviet Union at that time, does not compare with the attractiveness of getting a green card or indefinite leave to remain in the United Kingdom and elsewhere. So I think that was always an unfortunate comparison to make. There's one final thing, which is a lot of critics of the Biden administration say, why on earth didn't they keep Bagram open? But I'm not sure that's a good criticism, because Bagram is 35 k's outside Kabul. That would have given the Taliban total control of who got to the airport or not. So I'm not sure that is true, but I must say, I think that sort of leaving Kandahar Air Base and leaving Bagram Air Base at night, leaving the lights on or switching the lights off, leaving surreptitiously, and leaving those vast amounts of vehicles and helicopters and aircraft and munitions behind, I think has left a very bad impression of the exit as an act of implementation rather than just as a decision.
And it looks very much like defeat as well. There's been some criticism in some Western countries that the UK and other like-minded nations should have stepped in and somehow filled the void left by the United States. Was that ever realistic?
Well, I don't think so. I don't think so, Richard. I mean, I remember being very struck in, I think it was April 2002, flying into Kandahar. We were in a British helicopter and we were circling over Kandahar, while the 4th, I think it was, Marine Expeditionary Unit of US Marines was about to leave on an operation to Kost. And I remember the British military guy, came on the intercom and said, "Tim, have a look at that," he said. I think there were 60 Chinooks all hovering over Kandahar, and then they swooped off towards Kost. And he said, I hope you realize that's more helicopters than we have in the total UK inventory. And that is one US unit going off on an operation. I think we just don't understand the sheer scale of US military capability and power. And, to keep ground attack capability in the air over Afghanistan, or KAZIVAK or QRF, takes an enormous amount of logistical power and just sheer military might and capability, the I-STAR capabilities and everything. And I must say, I was a bit shaken that our former Prime Minister, Theresa May, could stand up in the House of Parliament and say, well, why didn't we take over? The UK doesn't have anything near the capability to do that. And I very much doubt if you added in all the Germans and French and anything you could. I mean, one of the barometers of this is, I'm sure lots of your guests who served in Afghanistan know we were constantly begging and borrowing helicopters and so forth. In fact, there was an extraordinary
Not just helicopters, everything.
Everything, and fuel.
They used to call us the borrowers.
Yeah, and I remember there was an extraordinary moment in, I think it was 2008, when the Americans did an inventory of their helicopters in Afghanistan and found they had 56 more than they realized. Well, so I just don't think that argument holds water at all.
Okay, so next, can we address the collapse of the Afghan government and the army that supported it, and why it occurs so rapidly. Perhaps we can start with politics. There's been some criticism of Trump's and later Biden's negotiations with the Taliban that excluded the Ashraf Ghani government, which may have negatively impacted that government's credibility. Now, I recall that former British Foreign Secretary Malcolm Rifkind said the last time we remembered something like this happening was at the 1938 Munich conference, when Hitler and Chamberlain agreed to carve up of Czechoslovakia without reference at all to the Prague government. Do you agree that the US Taliban direct talks were a significant nail in the Kabul government coffin?
Yes, I do. I mean, it is an extraordinary decision to decide you're going to talk to, to the enemy of your ally, and not allow your ally to take part because the enemy will refuse to allow it a place at the table. I mean, that it really does seem to me. I mean, I keep on looking for, what is the element of the Khalilzad negotiation that I'm missing that sort of makes it justifiable. And I don't see it. I do think Zalmay Khalilzad ranks with Neville Chamberlain, really, in terms of the diplomacy behind this. I mean, looking for a scrap of understanding of the American position. And don't forget, this was under Trump, not Biden, to be fair. I do think the Afghan government was being extremely inflexible on the issue of negotiation. I think, there were members of the government, and Amrullah Saleh is one name that springs to mind. And I mean, in many ways, a fine person. But I think, he really did take a very, very clear view that, this is all about defeating the Taliban. And I think, he found the idea of negotiation extremely difficult to comprehend. So I can sort of see the point that the United States says, well, look, hang on a moment. We're spending this money in Afghanistan. We've got all this commitment in support of a government that, is not prepared to be helpful. So we'll just go behind their back, talk to the Taliban, and get the Taliban eventually to agree to talk to the Afghan government, which they did, to be fair. To be fair, part of the Doha agreement was that there should be an Afghan negotiation. Where I think the whole thing went wrong, it arguably wasn't so much in the Doha agreement, but was actually losing conditionality after the agreement had been signed. So, the Taliban just repeatedly flouted the terms of the agreement. I mean, firstly, they found every reason possible not to talk to the Afghan government. And again, to be fair, this was complicated by the election result, which meant there was a long period where it was unclear whether Ghani or Abdullah was actually going to be the next president. So, there was that aspect, but also the sheer number of killings. The war actually ramped up in intensity, and the sheer number of assassinations, of female judges and all of this sort of thing. And I think the most craven aspect of the Khalilzad negotiation or the Trump negotiation was not insisting on conditionality, not pulling back and saying, look, this stuff's going on, so we're now pulling out of this agreement. The truth of the matter is they didn't do that because they really wanted to leave. And I think Trump wanted to leave for political and possibly even electoral reasons. He would have liked to have left, I think, before the presidential election. So the implementation again, actually coming back to that word again, it was implementation of the Doha agreement, which I think was so disastrous. And then, the other thing, the releasing of 5,100 or whatever it was, Taliban prisoners, some of the most wanted people, and the pressure put by the United States on the Afghans to release those people. And I think sort of rather suggest to the Afghans that we've got ways of making sure that they won't return to the front line, which I think was spurious. I think, I think there's a lot for the US to reflect on about that period.
It's never a good idea to negotiate from a position of weakness. And if the other side understand your desire to get out, that is something that will be exploited mercilessly. But even with that political background, it wasn't inevitable, was it, that the Afghan army would collapse in the way it did? Is it simply that, as Biden put it, and I quote, Afghanistan's political leaders gave up and fled the country. The Afghan military collapsed, sometimes without trying to fight. How many generations of Americans' daughters and sons would you have me send to fight Afghans when Afghan's troops will not? So was it just simply that the Afghan troops gave up and wouldn't fight, or something else?
No, I think it was something else. I mean, let's look how the Afghan soldiers fought after 2014 and lost huge numbers. So no, I think it's quite understandable why the Afghan army collapsed. And I think I think in rough order of importance, it's like this. Soldiers are sentient human beings. They see what's going on. When the United States is talking to their enemy behind the backs of their government in Qatar and obliging the government to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners, they can see the way things were going. Meanwhile, the Taliban had a very effective outreach program. They were getting in touch with individual Afghan military units through tribal elders, through the local mullahs, and saying, look, if you lay down your arms and go home now, there will be no repercussions. And people took that very seriously. But and this brings me to another crucial point about the Afghan army, which is, you wouldn't want to be a Tajik officer in an Afghan Kandak battalion based in Lashkargah in Helmand when you think there might be a changeover in power. You want to get back to a Tajik area. Equally, you wouldn't want to be a Pashtun soldier, up in Kunduz, for example, necessarily, or in a formerly Northern Alliance area. So there's a sort of inbuilt problem in the Afghan army, really, which is that when things go badly wrong, people want to return to their villages, and they know they'd better do it pretty darn quick before that change happens. There was little, quite honestly. I mean, I think Biden's point about the government is more fair. I mean, I think the government was very corrupt. I think it was very corrupt, and it was very inflexible. And I think Ghani, I mean, all the reports one hears of Ghani was that he was living in the presidential palace, a little bit like Karzai did, slightly divorced from the reality about what was actually going on out on the streets. So I think the criticism of the government is right, but I don't accept the criticism of the Afghan army. I mean, we all know that the average Afghan Kandak was fairly weak and subject to all those problems which the Afghan army has always been subject to. Professor Gustosi has written a very good book on the Afghan army, and he goes right back to the days of the king and the days of the Soviets and so forth. But all the same problems, come out: the problems of drug use, problems of going absent without leave. And Gustosi also makes a very good point about Afghans, which is the strength of the Afghans, and what we all remember from the 19th century and the British experience. It's the strength from the Afghans isn't from their formed army, it's from their armed population. That's where they're strong. They don't naturally fit well, I think, into sort of formed units, as demonstrated, incidentally, by the very good performance of the Afghan Special Forces, particularly the famous triples, 333 and 444, who fought very well right up absolutely to the last minute, actually at Kabul airport, where they helped facilitate, the extraction of people, and actually, tragically, some of them personally got left behind during that process. So no, I don't buy the comment about the Afghan army. And was it inevitable? I think it was. I think once it was clear to people that the Taliban were coming and were going to take over, which is what I think you if you were an Afghan soldier, you had to deduce from what was going on in Doha and what happened after Doha, then they were going to make their own personal arrangements, and that's what we saw happen. It just, I mean, fascinatingly, I think evaporated is a very good word. They just sort of evaporated.
Yeah. You talked about the impact on the withdrawal of contractors, Western contractors, from impact on the Afghan Air Force, all the maintenance staff, air traffic control people, and all the rest of it. But actually, the army depends, equally, and I don't think people realize this quite so much, just how it depends so much on what the Americans call enablers, the intelligence and surveillance networks and the communication networks that the small American teams provide that enable them then to call upon what one Afghan general said to me, when I've got the entire firepower of the United States of America behind me, we know we cannot fail. When all that goes, of course, with it goes all that confidence. I mean, it was very noticeable to me in Iraq, when the Americans, an Iraqi division arrived with American mentors and teams embedded, just how much better they were than the British trained but unmentored Iraqi division that was in place. It was stark in terms of efficiency, effectiveness, but most of all, confidence. And it's that confidence issue that we somehow don't really understand, that our presence has. It gives people confidence. So perhaps for our final topic this evening, perhaps we can discuss the impact of what happened in Afghanistan, both for Afghanistan itself and globally. Now, if there is a silver lining to all of this, it's that since there was very little fighting because of that evaporation, there's been very little damage to Afghans' population and infrastructure. So unlike many wars, the Taliban have inherited a state more or less intact. People who've come back from Afghanistan since the fall say that apart from the change of flags, pretty much everything looks the same as it did before. So although it's too early to tell whether it's possible the Taliban may change its spots, or perhaps it's too early, do you think that over time Afghanistan could ever be at peace with itself? Or do the fissures in Afghan society run too deep?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, and of course, I mean, coming back actually almost to your previous point. I mean, one of the things I think we all need to reflect on very carefully is the extent to which we build dependency into these states. I think we've done it to an extent in Iraq, and we've done it in Afghanistan. And as you were saying yourself, the Afghan army, became dependent on American enablers. And I think we really do need to look back and think very carefully when we're engaging in nation building, which I suspect incidentally we won't do again, not for a very long time, how we do it in a way that that allows it not to be so dependent on our presence. And the same, I think, goes for the wider economy. You're right. I mean, Kabul is very little damaged, and much of the country is very little damaged. But of course, Afghanistan is completely dependent on on the Western financial system now, and with its funds frozen in by the World Bank and the IMF and so on and so forth, there's a very, very tricky period ahead. Not helped by the fact, I mean, Imran Khan is saying to us, Prime Minister of Pakistan, is saying, look, it's inevitable you're going to recognize the Taliban government, and you must. And I can see that is going to be the drift. And I can see there is a potential for negotiation there about preventing Al-Qaeda return in response to loosening up on some of the financial criteria. But I think there is a very fundamental problem, which is that the Taliban isn't a unitary organization. I mean, it comprises essentially two very different parts. One is, I think, loosely called the Kandaharis, which is the traditional Taliban, and the other is the Haqqani group. And I think there's a widespread misunderstanding about the Haqqani group, that the Haqqani group is actually, it is part of the Taliban, it is true, but it is also a separate entity in its own, and and let's face it, listed by many countries as a terrorist organization, and with historically very close links to Al-Qaeda and other groups such as Lashkar-e-Taiba and other groups. So I think the process by which relations are normalized are not straightforward at all. And with winter coming on, there is going to be a pressure. There is going to be pressure, and and as we see TV pictures of people suffering in Afghanistan, I think it's going to put the West in a very, very difficult situation. Not as difficult, of course, as the one that Pakistan is going to be in.
Has the Taliban, or will the Taliban be able to put an end to ethnically based warlordism, if I can put it in those terms?
Well, I mean, one of the most interesting aspects of the Taliban takeover this time is that in a sense, you have to admire their focus, is that they really did focus on the northern areas, in particular, the Uzbek areas, the Tajik areas, less so on the Hazara areas, which is going to be a tricky area, policy area, you can imagine. But I thought it was very, very interesting how the Northern Alliance option, which was the option right the way through, in the 90s and so forth, in which the Hazaras, the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, and a few Pashtuns then come together to form a very powerful bloc, was no longer really available. I mean, the Panjshiris tried a small resistance in the Panjshir Valley, but that folded pretty quickly. And the rest of the North wasn't up for it. Now, why was it not up for it? And I think there are two reasons, really. I think, above all, I don't think pretty much anybody believed in the Afghan government anymore. And I'm not talking about the educated elite, who are the people we hear and see on our televisions the whole time, the NGOs, the women's groups, and so forth. But, I mean, it's very, very difficult, isn't it, to gauge the mood of a population. But I mean, it would not be surprising to think that villagers, not only in the Pashtun areas of the south and the east, but in the Tajik and Uzbek areas of the north, were thoroughly fed up with the war, could see the way the war was going, and thought to themselves, well, look, quite honestly, what we would like is peace and security, rather than an ongoing war. And I'm not saying that they like the Taliban, I'm sure they don't, but the lesser of two evils. And I wonder whether that is a whole area that we in our policymakers just missed, actually. I wonder, I mean, there are probably people on the call who know whether Pew did, polls of public sentiment and so forth, but I suspect they probably didn't, and I suspect we missed that.
Interesting. So, I mean, you're suggesting that for the vast majority of Afghans outside Kabul, whatever ethnic, wherever they come from, the ethnic divide, actually the Taliban government has brought peace.
I think so, and I was always very struck, in Helmand in 2006, 7, 8. I mean, I got the strong impression that villagers actually quite liked the British soldiers in Sangin or Musakala or whatever, and there was all the stuff of giving them boiled sweets and barrows and all of that sort of stuff. But I think it was also very, very clear, even back then, that villagers knew that ultimately it was not worth taking any risks with the British, because the Taliban will come back one day and there would be all hell to pay for those people who had collaborated. So, so yes, I think at a village level, although the Taliban, in a lot of the country are deeply unpopular, there was a sort of certain inevitability that NATO ultimately were going to run out of patience. And that this isn't sort of high level, geopolitical thinking. This is villagers just working it out for themselves, and just like Afghan army soldiers worked it out for themselves.
Finally, let's look at it from a more global perspective. The big questions over what happened in Afghanistan all revolve around the USA and its standing in the world. In particular vis-a-vis China. Sorry, not just China, but Russia, and also radical Islam, which we haven't really touched upon. Now, President Biden explained the withdrawal as clearing away the chaff, the unimportant, from America's foreign policy, so he can focus on what's important. His detractors claim it's a defeat for Western liberalism worldwide that will only strengthen the West's adversaries. What do you think? Painful but necessary step, or an unmitigated disaster?
Well, I would be more on the side of unmitigated disaster. I mean, maybe mitigated disaster if that's allowed. Look, there is a danger of overstating this, obviously. I mean, the United States was defeated badly in Vietnam, and it would be wrong to say it bounced back. It took quite a long time to come back, but, you know, it recovered. And I think it's much too early to talk about defeat of Western liberalism. But I think it was a really, really major reverse. Now, I mean, China and Russia are actually, both of them pretty worried about Afghanistan. Russia from the point of view of militant Islam, China from the point of view of the Uyghur Turkestan issue. None of them actually ecstatic at the American withdrawal, but they're certainly ecstatic at the messaging of this, which looks like an American defeat, and ditto Iran. I mean, this has been, from their point of view, a humiliating experience for the United States, and that I think is a real concern. And I wonder, I mean, I wonder whether this doesn't fit into, you know, the narrative of increasing Chinese assertiveness that we've seen in Hong Kong and in the northern borders of India, and now, of course, with these flights over Taiwan and so forth. This is all part of the gradual ending of the unipolar moment, as they call it, towards the situation where we now have two superpowers rather than one. But also, apart from that, a number of other powers which now feel emboldened by US lack of foreign policy engagement. And don't forget, this isn't Biden. This started in 2012 with Obama not wishing to get involved in the Libya campaign. So this is now 3 administrations have decided this isn't stuff we want to do anymore. And this has given countries like Turkey, like UAE, like Qatar, a feeling that they can be more assertive on the world stage, as we've seen. So foreign policy world is a lot more crowded than it was in the early days of the Obama administration. So all of these things, I think, are geopolitically important. But I think almost the more important point than the effects on China, Russia, and Iran are the effects on US allies. I think Singapore, for example, will have looked at this and thought, you know, taking risks for the United States is just now that little bit riskier than it was. And ditto Modi, I think, in India, who, you know, has been quite pugnacious up on the northern border against China. He may just look at this and think, well, maybe I just need to sort of trim my aggressiveness a little, because, you know, can we really rely on the United States to deliver? And I mean, that let's face it, is a position that even the UK, France, and Germany have been very, very clearly been seen to take. Now, on the other side of it, and this is particularly interesting, I think, with the Australian dimension, you know, a couple of weeks after the withdrawal, we've had the announcement of AUKUS agreements, and obviously your institute have been talking about this a lot, and I think that has done quite a lot to restore morale, I think, in the West, that, you know, we still have a coherent foreign policy, and that sort of, in a sense, justifies the Biden line that he's cleared away the chaff and he's now focusing on the key issue, which you know, in a sense, are the 4 C's: climate, cyber, COVID, and above all, in a foreign policy context, China. But coming back to your general point, I think whether or not the decision was a good one, that comes back to our earlier discussion. It was the implementation that will stick in people's minds. And that picture of that C-17 trying to take off with people clinging to it and people falling to the ground, those are the images that I think will stick. And I don't think there can be any doubt. I mean, just look at Tony Blinken's face during that crisis, the man who was clearly exhausted. This wasn't a sort of sign of a muscular country realigning its priorities. This looked like something a lot more negative.
Tim, thank you very much. That's, for me, it's been a really fascinating discussion. I know we've got some questions from our members and guests, so perhaps I'll invite Alastair to moderate them for us. Yep. Alastair, please.
We certainly have, and thank you, Tim. Just fascinating detail there, and we'll get through as many questions as we can. Just coming back to the negotiations between the US and the Taliban. They, apart from promising to withdraw not only their own forces, they'd allegedly also said that their allies would withdraw. Is that something that was cleared with the UK, do you know, beforehand, or did it just come out in the Khalilzad discussions?
Well, to tell the truth, I really don't know. I mean, certainly, as you know, in the very last moments, with the suddenness of the withdrawal, the British Chief of Defence Staff, Nick Carter, came on the radio and clearly said that we were unhappy with the lack of consultation. But I think it was a given back in when the Doha Agreement was signed that, you know, I think we knew what Khalilzad had signed up to. Again, I think it was the sudden, you know, because remember when Biden came to power, the first thing he did was announce that Sullivan and Blinken would carry out a review of Afghan policy. I think everybody thought, well, that gives us several months to sort ourselves out and understand what's going on. I think that then everyone was very surprised with the speed of what was, if you remember what then happened, was really quite an intemperate letter was sent to Ashraf Ghani, saying you've got to do this, this, or this. And then the Ghani government came back and said, and sort of played for time, essentially. And then suddenly, the announcement of withdrawal. So what I think everyone assumed would be a more carefully structured process suddenly got very, very curtailed for reasons I'm not quite sure of what happened. Whether the idea of a review was never really intended to be a deep review or was intended to be a quick review or not. So I think, yeah, we were caught by surprise at the end of it, but I don't think we were caught by surprise at the Doha stage.
Thank you. Looking ahead, and we're going to bounce around a little bit here, I'm afraid, as I go through these, but Afghanistan has got some considerable mineral resources that have not really been exploited yet, but potentially as batteries are developed and you know, issues that, you know, minerals that are scarce relatively in the West. Do you think it's likely that China potentially could end up as a beneficiary of the Taliban controlling all of this?
Yeah, I mean, of course, China jumped in. I mean, the Americans did this review of mineral resources in Afghanistan. I forget, it must have been about 2006, 2005, something like that. And then, of course, China jumped in straight away and started working on copper projects, and I think on gold projects as well. But I think China is going to face exactly the same problems that we faced, which is, you know, how do you carry out these operations in such an unstable country? Now, they probably have less draconian health and safety legislation and so forth than we do. But actually, to be fair to the Chinese, they've got a very, very low appetite for taking casualties. I mean, many of your listeners know that there is a copper mine at Sindak just on the Pakistan side of the Pakistan-Afghan-Iran border, in the corner over there. And when Chinese workers are either killed or kidnapped, Beijing take it very, very seriously indeed. So I find it hard to imagine that China is going to be able to exploit those mineral resources unless peace can come to the whole of Afghanistan, and that's a big if. And I think that would take. I mean, I think the one thing we haven't really discussed here, and I think is an important point, and I think a disappointing point really, is that if you look at it, the United States, China, Russia, India, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Iran, in fact, all want to see a stable Afghanistan, all with slightly different permutations. But I find it really disappointing. I mean, Blinken had the idea of an Istanbul summit in which we would bring together all the regional powers. And I find it really disappointing that we didn't give it one try at a proper international solution to Afghanistan. And obviously, China and Russia weren't, would have wanted the United States to leave, but the United States had decided to leave. There was surely the opportunity but it would have been difficult and it would have been long, and there would have been wreckers undoubtedly who would have made it more difficult. But I think that was a whole area that remained unexplored.
Thank you. Do you think the Taliban have either the ability or the expertise to start governing the country effectively? I mean, to what extent are they motivated, I suppose, by diplomatic recognition internationally? Are they likely to hold elections to play into that role, do you think?
I mean, there's been a major effort, obviously, since they lost power, for the Taliban to sort of reinvent themselves to an extent. And Mullah Baradar, I think, is the case in point of the person who sort of got it, the need to change. And one senses there may have been a degree of Pakistani assistance as well in assisting the sort of presentational skills. But I think the difficulty that the Taliban has, there may be a few in the Taliban leadership who understand this, but the vast majority of the Taliban have been fighting a very, very long war, and a lot of them are for very understandable reasons educated, uneducated, and have been extremely hardened by their experiences. So I don't think the Taliban have got, even if there were a few people at the top who wanted to turn the Taliban into a more sort of inclusive organization, I don't think they've got the people who could implement it. Coming back to that implementation word again, which is sort of so crucial. So I think they're going to find that extremely hard.
Okay. What's your view of the motivation for Pakistan to be so close to the Taliban and continuing to be so close to the new regime there?
Well, again, to be fair to the Pakistanis, who've taken a lot of criticism for this, they've never hidden the fact that a Pashtun Islamist government in Kabul is the best way to ensure that India can't establish a foothold in Afghanistan. And we in Britain should understand that, because it's actually very, very similar to the British policy of keeping the Russians out of Afghanistan right the way through the 19th and early 20th century, which was actually done with considerable success, albeit the occasional disaster. Pakistan has taken very much the same line for understandable reasons. They've hinted on occasions that they are willing to consider a more inclusive government, but I don't think they could have accepted Ashraf Ghani. They certainly couldn't have accepted Amrullah Saleh. Ghani was close to the Indians, as was Saleh. So they wanted to see that lot gone, and I don't think they've ever really dissembled on that.
You talked about Amrullah Saleh and Pancho Valley in passing. What do you think are the chances of any substantial resistance forming? I mean, whether that's with former members of the military or some of these other individuals?
I think it's very difficult. I mean, for a number of reasons. Firstly, in the days of Ahmed Shah Massoud, they had the escape route into Tajikistan. They had whole swathes of the north that they controlled, including right over towards Herat, for example, which they controlled thanks to Ismail Khan. And of course, they had major Pashtun players like Professor Sayyaf as well on their side. So this is very different. Also, Massoud was a hardened guerrilla leader. he didn't hanker after the good life in the West at all. I mean, he wanted to stay with his guys in the Panjshir Valley, and he was a very shrewd tactician. I don't think there's anybody like that, either willing to share the hardships of life in the Panjshir, or with the same sort of tactical nous that Masood has. So I think the chances aren't great. I mean, the Panjshir Valley does offer, you know, due to the mountains and stuff, it offers a haven for people to hide. But are they going to be able to take on the Kabul government? I find it most unlikely. And I'm not sure those governments which supported the Panjshiris, notably Iran, Russia, and India, I think are going to want to do it anymore, because they're going to want to actually put their chips into some sort of, you know, agreements with the Kabul government. You know, in India's case, you know, to allow consulates and embassies and road building and stuff. You know, and Iran's case to ensure that the Hazaras are kept safe, and in Russia's case to stop the move of militant Islam further north. So I'm not confident that the Panjshiri thing is going to become like it was in the past.
It was quite striking, just seeing, you know, all those scenes as Kabul fell, of the Taliban, you know, appearing suddenly in all this American uniforms and night vision goggles and you know, driving around in Humvees. I mean, to what extent is all that equipment that was left behind making a difference to them, or is it a question that it's going to be falling into disrepair or lack of maintenance before long? I mean, is it really making a difference to them as a military force?
Well, I mean, if I was a Taliban leader, I would say, look, you know, we've just defeated the world's, you know, most impressive Western alliance using mobile phones, IEDs, and Honda 50cc scooters. You know, why do we need Humvees? And you know, I mean, it seems to me that is their strength. I mean, obviously they're not going to. Obviously, they will try and get helicopters working and some of the aircraft working and stuff. Because they are now a national government, and they'll need to get some of that working. But yes, I find it sort of slightly interesting, actually, that having defeated the world's premier superpower, they then felt they wanted to pick up the M1 carbines and put on the American helmets. Very strange, but I don't think massively significant.
Okay, just one question: do you know what's happened to Abdullah?
Well, you know, Karzai and Abdullah got, you know, clearly understood that they somehow would be part of the future of Afghanistan, and stayed on. And I only know one person who's seen Abdullah in recent weeks, and he was still living in his house. And the person said to me it was a rather disturbingly opulent house, and it felt rather out of kilter about what has happened to what has happened in Afghanistan. I find it hard to believe that both Karzai and Abdullah have not been to some extent duped. It would be great if a role could be found for them, because that would be a serious role could be found for them. But it's hard to believe that the hardened members of the Haqqani group are going to want those people sort of front and center of a future of Afghan government with genuine influence. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if those two characters don't eventually go into exile.
Interesting. And what about the drug trade? Is that going to be seen as something to be stamped out, or are they going to be using it for revenue?
Well, I mean, there was that really interesting period in the early years of the Taliban government when they stamped out the drugs trade. I think there was a particular year when production went down to a very, very low level. That, of course, as always with the drugs trade, then had a negative effect because it pushed up the prices so much that then the trade then became more profitable. and picked up again. I suspect the Taliban will have exactly the same problem with the drugs trade that we had. I don't know if you remember that the UK, whether wisely or not, volunteered to be the lead nation on counter-narcotics, and ultimately found that the economics of counter-narcotics defeated it at every turn. So the more successful you were, the higher the price went up, the bigger risks for people were to take to do it. So I think the Afghan opium industry is with us for a very long time.
That's interesting. We got a comment from someone who I imagine is actually from Afghanistan, but saying, many Afghans are feeling a sense of abandonment by the US and its allies. I mean, particularly those who had been assisting and were not able to be got out and left behind. What do you think this means for future engagement with the Afghan people? I mean, to try and move beyond dealing through the regime.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really difficult. The speed with which the world moves on to other issues is extraordinary. I mean, if you remember that week or 10 days of the Afghan crisis at Kabul airport, it was all over the news. Already now, it's rarely mentioned. There are still some journalists in there producing some good reporting. And of course, there are the people who were left behind and people who've been assured that if they can find their way to third countries, all our consulates there will be ready to issue them with visas and so forth. But the truth of the matter is the world does move on, I'm afraid, and there are going to be people left behind. And I think that's just I'm afraid that's just a very depressing fact of life. And plays to Richard's point, I think, that we were talking about earlier, which is, I think people are going to be more wary of trusting the West in future. On the other hand, we cannot just take out, a huge chunk of educated Afghans who the future of Afghanistan is going to rely on if that country is to sort of recover to any extent. So like all these problems, this is a very, very complex problem with sort of many aspects to it.
And fast moving, yes. What are your views on the future of women in Afghanistan now that this has happened?
Well, I think it's looking grim. And there was a report on the BBC last night that the Taliban have taken a position, certainly in one of the provinces, that girls over the age of 12 shouldn't go to school. And I think, if I recall correctly, that was the age that they used to talk about during their first period in government. So I think the prospects for women's education and for sort of women's freedom look very poor indeed. There's another factor that, if that meeting in the Oval Office had been more holistic and had discussed the whole area of issues around Afghanistan, I think they might have come to a different outcome.
I was just going to off mute. We're rapidly approaching. I think, Richard, your viewing questions, I think, so is there anything you'd like to jump in on at the end, or we're obviously not going to get through them all, so apologies to the audience, but there've been
I just wanted to actually just sort of echo Tim's final point, just how bloody difficult strategy is. Tim described, sort of Biden's world viewpoint and his emotional state leading to that significant strategic decision, which I think most of us would agree, was misguided. But he did it with the best intentions, and it is so difficult to get these big strategic decisions right. He obviously thought he was doing the right thing, and was frightened of strategic drift, just continuing because doing what we had always done, but in the end proved, I think, wrong. It will have a significant impact on the United States and indeed the rest of us for some time to come, I think. So you're on mute, Alastair.
I think I have this right by now. It brings us neatly to our hour. I mean, we could have going on and on, I think. I mean, it's such a complex environment and situation, and you've covered so much detail, Tim. Thank you for your knowledge and background there. We obviously weren't going to get through all the questions, but thank you to the audience for such good questions and so much interest. Thank you to Richard for leading the discussion, and Tim in particular for coming and taking part and giving us so much of your insight and wisdom there. It's been a really good session. So thank you both very much. And
Tim, thank you very much indeed. Farewell.
All right. Thank you all.